Hey everyone, welcome to week 8. As I was thinking about some of our discussions from week 7, especially in relation to 1 Corinthians 11 and the celebration of the Eucharist or communion or the Lord's Supper, however your tradition identifies that central meal of worship and gathering, I thought of the experience that I've observed over the years of my kids as participants in that meal. So this isn't very rehearsed, but I thought that maybe as part of this intro video, looking back on week 7, this intro video now for week 8, I might just ask them and see what they say about what your experience is like in our church when we have Eucharist, we have communion together. We usually do it the first Sunday of every month, sometimes more often. So, Amaya, let's start with you. What's that experience like for you?
It's really cool because I get to go up with my family, and it's really yummy too because it's good.
Yeah, you guys always go up and get any leftover bread afterwards, right? At the end. Yeah, so we don't let any of the body of the Lord go to waste. The kids usually make sure that it is all consumed by the end of the day or the end of the service. Judah, how about you, buddy?
I like it because we get to dip it into berry juice.
You like it because we get to dip it into berry juice? Anything else about communion that you like?
No.
I think
No?
it's cool that we have kind of a unique thing in our church, and we are able to do that.
Yeah? Okay, cool. Isaiah, did you want to add anything? No? Okay, so my two older kids are kind of getting ready for church here, but the reason I think it's worth pondering a little bit is it's clear, I think, to kids that moment in a church's life is a pregnant one, is an important one. And when they are welcomed into that moment and made participants like others, I think there's an experience of being received and treated as a full member of the community as a child that often our church dynamics don't communicate to children really well. So I know as I've watched our kids over the years, they will sometimes be away from the service and then come back to the service for the time of Eucharist, and they will, they'll be super excited to participate in this ritual with the rest of the church. And I think I didn't have the sort of understanding of the meal to anticipate that earlier in our life, and as I've reflected on it more over the years, I'm not as surprised as I was then that they would find this to be fun, exciting, because it's a way in which they're welcomed into the heart of the church as sharers with everyone else. And a lot of the social arrangements and dynamics that they experience in their lives often have them on the margins of adult life when they're doing their important things. And by contrast, the Eucharist welcomes them right into the middle. All right, thanks, guys.
Bye!
Bye.
Okay, so just trying to think through what's coming up for week 8 with you, just to kind of get you ready. Of course, you know that you've got a book review coming due at the end of this week. The book by my colleague Joel Green called Seized by Truth. And as you'll find in the syllabus, that review is designed to help you think critically in conversation with Joel Green about how the Bible has come to us, the way that the different traditions of the Christian church and influences on us as readers, or there goes the dog, or interpreters of the Bible, the way that affects the sense that we make of it. We don't read in a vacuum, nor are we simply reading according to certain theological questions. We're always reading as people influenced by the way our church traditions have transmitted these words to us, and the concerns and maybe even obsessions of our time as we come to Scripture. So I think many people in the evangelical tradition have been formed to regard that as a threat in some ways, as if we were supposed to minimize the various influences that mediate between us in Scripture so as to really get to the inner core of it or the heart of it. But Joel's book is insightful, I think, because it shows us that there's no such Bible that's uninfluenced by the communities of people that transmit it to us. And reading it well is not a matter of minimizing those influences necessarily, but subjecting them to certain kinds of disciplines so that we can read the Scripture as genuinely authoritative, but as words that are conveyed to us by the gifts of God in the church community. So I think it's an important topic for reflection. We thought about it a little bit earlier when we were studying the book of Acts, and this will give us a chance as we're getting towards the end of our course to dive a little bit deeper. You will be starting to get back your working papers this week as well, because I want you to have the feedback from those before you start working in earnest on your last working paper, which will be on a passage from one of the letters that we're studying in the New Testament. And then, of course, we're finally going to get this week into some of Paul's more well-known writings. We'll be reading Romans together and then focusing on Galatians together, a little bit of work in Ephesians as well. And I hope that the way I've structured the course has equipped you to come to these more well-known letters of Paul's with perhaps some new questions or sensibilities, maybe a new set of eyes, so that you will be able to see that what Paul has been teaching us in Philemon and Philippians, even 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and now 1st and 2nd Corinthians about church as a family life of sharing that breaks down some of the deepest divisions that we have inherited between master and slave, for example, breaks down divisions within each of us as well, unites us to one another, gives us also a kind of peace as we relate to one another, not from a place of having to boast or prove who we are, but being welcomed by one another. I hope that you'll see that those themes that have characterized the letters we've already studied are, in fact, extremely relevant. They're basic even to what Paul is teaching in Galatians on justification by faith. So this kind of formulaic doctrine of Protestant Christianity that has so often been a weapon, not only against our Catholic sisters and brothers, but I think even against one another, where it has become this way of testing whether or not people have the right beliefs so that they can belong to the community. This doctrinal formulation, if we restore it to this picture, hopefully, of Paul that we've been developing, and of course restore it to a careful consideration of its place in Galatians, Romans as well, an analogous presentation in Ephesians, we see that it's not a weapon for separating the good guys from the bad guys. It's not a weapon for deciding who's in and who's out. In fact, it is a way of naming how God has welcomed us by a mercy for which we could never take credit, and consequently empowered us to share that mercy with one another. So that's going to be a focus of this week as we study justification by faith alone in Galatians in particular. I hope that you'll find that illuminating and perhaps enriching for you if you have grown up in the church tradition and found some of the Protestant emphasis on that to be part of this kind of puritanical Paul that is not very hospitable. And I think that's partly because it's not very true to Paul's teaching. We'll spend a little bit of time in Ephesians as well. That's a beautiful and demanding letter. Talk a little bit about the powers that Paul introduces in that letter, in the similar text of Colossians, principalities and powers, how to understand the presence or activity of these powers as they shape human life and how they relate to the presence of the risen Christ among us, how his death and resurrection addressed those powers, how that's then unfolding in our life together. And that's going to take us finally to a consideration of one of the more difficult, I think, kind of parts of the Pauline corpus. And it's one that I introduced with the reading from Howard Thurman, Jesus and the Disinherited, as we got started with Paul. And it's the household instructions, sometimes called household code. I don't like code too well because I think that already sort of forces the words into a certain construal that we ought to question. But there are these relatively formulaic instructions that Paul gives in some of his letters that deal with household relationships. Household, of course, being a somewhat equivocal term because household in Paul's context is quite different from what passes as a household in most of our context today. We're talking about a full domestic order, not simply a nuclear family, for example. That's so typical of the way people make households in certain parts of the West, maybe not as common in other parts of the world. Our students who are participating from other parts of the world, Africa, for example, might be able to give us some enlightening insight into household dynamics when they include not just parents and children, but several generations. In Paul's context, would also include slaves. And so you're talking about a whole economic order of relating to one another that is basic to the provision of food and other goods that are crucial for human life. And Paul speaks to these particular relationships. The basic ones are that between husband and wife, parents and children, and master and slave. And you might say subjects the dynamics of those relationships to God's revelation in the Messiah. In some ways, those have been used, those instructions, as Howard Thurman records, to reinforce particularly violent expressions of those divisions. And we'll want to ask as we study Paul's household instruction in Ephesians if that is a faithful interpretation of that instruction, or if perhaps we might come to those words with a different sensibility so that they would not simply reinforce oppressive divisions, but serve to bring them under the judgment of Christ, which is a liberating judgment. So I look forward to our discussion on that range of questions. Of course, it will involve us in some conversation about gender dynamics in the church community and beyond. Those, I think, are urgent discussions for us to have, especially in our time. So I look forward to studying this week with you. Hope you're hanging in there as we're coming to the end of the course these last few weeks. I also hope that you're beginning to have the experience this week with the experience of I'm gaining some skill as an interpreter, as a reader of the New Testament. That's really one of the basic goals of this class, is to equip you to read the text of the New Testament with more patience and insight. I see that in evidence, frankly, in your work, but I hope it's also part of your own experience that you're growing, even through what I know for many of you has been a variety of challenges that the class has brought to you. So thanks for your commitment and your hard work. Look forward to sharing the week's study with you.